The alien academy was silent as the heavy doors opened with a long metallic creak. The sound carried through the great hall, like a warning to all who sat waiting. Rows of young minds from many worlds sat in silence, their strange eyes glowing in the dim light, their bodies shifting with nervous energy. Each student was different, some with scales that shimmered faintly, some with wings folded close, others with skin like stone, and at the far end of the row sat a lone human, his figure calm, his face without fear, his eyes steady. The teacher entered, tall and cold, his scaled skin gleaming under the pale light, his steps heavy on the floor as he carried a glass case locked tight. The case shook faintly as if something inside was alive and restless. A soft sound like claws scratching against crystal filled the air. Already whispers broke through the room, quiet words filled with dread, for every student knew this teacher was not kind. His lessons were tests of strength and terror, and today felt different, darker, heavier. He placed the glass case on the central table with care, yet his long fingers lingered on the lock, as if savoring the moment. His mouth curved into a sharp smile. He spoke with a voice that carried like a hiss. Today you will see true danger. Today you will learn respect for death. And with a flick of his hand the lock clicked open, and the lid lifted. From within the shadows poured creatures that made the room shake with fear. Long black bodies covered in sharp spines, glowing veins under their skin like rivers of fire, stingers dripping with liquid venom that hissed as it touched the glass surface. They crawled out in swarms, their many legs scratching with a sound that pierced the ears, clicking mandibles snapping open and shut as if hungry for flesh. The other students recoiled instantly, some pressing against the walls, some curling in. Fear, a chorus of panic filled the chamber. The teacher raised his arms with pride, his scaled face full of cruel delight. He spoke again. These are the venomous death crawlers of my world. One drop of their poison can kill even the strongest warrior. One bite can bring endless agony until silence follows. He looked at the creatures as if they were his children. Creatures bred from centuries of survival. Creatures of endless fear. Then he turned his gaze to his students, expecting horror, expecting obedience, expecting silence. And he received it, silence and trembling, except for one. The human sat still, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the table where the creatures crawled, his breath slow, his hand steady. There was no sign of fear in his face, no tremor in his voice when he raised his hand high in the air. The movement so calm that it cut through the chaos. All heads turned toward him in disbelief. Even the teacher's smile faltered, for no student ever dared to interrupt his deadly lesson. The human spoke, his tone quiet yet strong, his words sharp as a blade through fog. Are they edible? The room froze. The insects clicked and hissed, but the students forgot their noise. All eyes locked on the strange human who dared to ask such a thing. Alien faces twisted with shock. Whispers rose again. Words like madness, insanity, foolishness. Yet none could look away. The teacher himself narrowed his eyes, the cruel smile slowly fading as his mind struggled to hold power. His voice rose. What did you say? And the human repeated, calm as before, are they edible? The question echoed in the vast chamber, carrying weight heavier than fear. The teacher's claws tapped against the table as he tried to mask his unease. The insects crawled closer to the human's side, their venom dripping bright under the light. Yet the human did not move back, did not flinch, did not show fear. His face almost curious, as if he were not in a hall of death, but in a simple lesson back home, a lesson where danger was nothing new. The other students leaned away from him, their bodies pressed against the walls. They looked at him as if he were more dangerous than the insects. Whispers turned to silence again, for there was no laughter here, only confusion, only dread. The teacher stared at him, his scaled lips pulling into a thin line. And for the first time in many cycles his voice carried hesitation instead of pride. Do you think you can eat them, human? The human tilted his head slightly, the faintest trace of a smile on his lips. He gave no fear, no surrender, only quiet curiosity. The insects hissed louder, the glow of their venom lighting the space like small fires, and in that moment the balance of the room shifted. The teacher no longer held the power of fear. It was stolen, quietly, simply, by a question, are they edible? And with those words, the hall waited, every creature in the room frozen between terror and awe. The lesson had only just begun. but already the human had turned it into something else, something no one there could ever forget. The words of the human lingered in the vast chamber, like a blade cutting through fog. The teacher stood with his scaled hands resting against the table, his eyes narrowing, as the venomous insects crawled across the surface, their glowing veins pulsing like small rivers of light dripping poison that hissed with every drop on the glass. Yet the only sound that carried in that moment was the question of the human, his voice calm, his eyes steady, his body free from tremor. Are they edible? The silence pressed heavy against the walls. The alien students sat frozen, their strange faces painted with disbelief, some with gills that fluttered nervously, some with feathers that shook against their backs, others with tails curled tight around their chairs. None dared to speak, none dared to move. They had come to learn fear and obedience, but instead they found themselves staring at a creature who asked if death could be eaten. The teacher tried to recover his control. His voice rose in a sharp hiss. He demanded to know if the human was mocking him, if this question was a foolish attempt to show defiance. But the human did not flinch. His hand still raised, his tone still calm. He repeated his question, "Are they edible?" as if the matter was nothing more than simple curiosity, as if the deadly swarm was no more frightening than a plate of food placed on a table at supper. The teacher slammed his clawed hand down onto the glass table. The sound cracked like thunder. Through the hall the insects scattered hissing, but the human did not even blink. The teacher leaned forward, his scaled mouth curling into a cold sneer. He asked if the human wished to die, if he wanted to taste agony, before his life ended in poison. Yet even as the venom dripped only inches from his arm, the human tilted his head slightly, his eyes following the crawling bodies with a strange calmness, and he spoke again softly, almost gently, saying that where he came from, creatures like these were not only feared, they were also hunted, and sometimes they were eaten. Whispers spread again, this time sharper, filled with shock. Alien voices calling the human insane, mad, cursed. Yet their eyes betrayed something else, a shadow of doubt, a spark of wonder. They had all seen humans before. They had all been told that humans were weak, that humans were fragile. But here before them was one who looked into the eyes of venom and spoke of it as if it were a meal. The weight of the silence pressed harder and harder until even the teacher himself began to feel it. The teacher finally spoke again, his voice lower, no longer as sure as before. He asked if the human would dare to touch one of the insects, if he was bold enough to let the venom sting his flesh. The other students gasped at the thought, their bodies trembling, their eyes wide. Yet the human simply leaned a little closer to the table, his gaze fixed upon the creatures crawling across the surface. His fingers rested near the edge, not touching, not yet, but close enough for the teacher to see that fear did not live within him. The human began to speak, and his words were slow and steady. He told them of his world of Earth, of places where death lived in every corner of the land, where jungles were alive with snakes coiled in trees, their fangs filled with venom, where deserts were ruled by scorpions hiding under stones with stingers waiting to strike, where the oceans carried fish that could kill with a single bite or a single spine. Yet humans lived there, not only lived but thrived. They learned to fight, they learned to adapt, they learned to use fire, to cook, to transform danger into survival. The alien students shivered at the thought, some unable to imagine a world so cruel and wild. The teacher himself narrowed his eyes, his sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. But he said nothing, for the story of the human carried more weight than any threat. The human continued, telling how his ancestors had taken venomous creatures, cooked them over fire, removed their poison, and turned them into food. How what killed others became strength for humans. How survival on Earth was not about hiding from danger, but facing it, changing it, bending it, until it no longer held power. The teacher tapped his clawed fingers against the table. The insects crawled closer, their glowing veins brushing against the glass. The sound of their legs scratching filled the silence. Yet even as death hissed, the human did not move back. He did not break his calm. The other students looked at him now with something more than fear. They looked with unease, with respect, with the first faint spark of awe. The teacher finally spoke again, his voice cold, but weaker than before. He asked if the human wished to eat one now here, before them all, if he wished to prove his claim before the class. The words hung heavy in the chamber. The students gasped again, some whispering that this was madness, that no flesh could survive the sting of the crawlers, that the poison alone could rot the body from the inside. Yet all eyes turned to the human, waiting to see if his calm was real or only a mask. The human did not answer at once. He let the silence stretch his eyes, still steady, his fingers brushing the surface near the creatures. He leaned slightly closer, his breath fogging the glass. He studied the way their mandibles clicked, the way their stingers dripped, and finally he spoke, his voice quiet but clear, saying that he could eat them, but not raw, not in their poisoned state. He explained that on Earth humans learned to cook creatures of venom, to use flame and heat to strip death from their flesh and to make them safe for the stomach. He said that eating danger was not madness, it was survival, it was life for his kind. The teacher hissed at his words, his scales shifting with unease. He tried to laugh, tried to mock, saying that only fools would dare to cook death. But his laugh did not echo strong, it faltered and died against the silence of the room, for the students were no longer laughing, they were no longer only afraid, they were staring at the human, as if he were not prey, but predator. The insects crawled closer to the human, now their bodies glowing brighter, their venom dripping in heavy drops, the clicking of their mandibles echoing in the hall. The human leaned back slightly, but not in fear, only in patience, his eyes still calm, his lips carrying the faintest trace of a smile. The other students held their breath, waiting, watching. Even the teacher felt the balance slipping. The lesson that had begun as fear was turning into something else, something he could not control. And then the human spoke once more, his voice steady, his tone without tremor. He said to the teacher and to every student in the chamber that on his world they learned not only to fear death, but to change it, to face it, to claim it as part of life. He said that if these creatures carried venom then to humans, that was not the end, that was only another challenge to be solved, another trial to be turned into strength. The chamber remained silent. The insects hissed, the students watched, the teacher stared, and in that silence the weight of the human words pressed down heavier than the venom itself. The human had not touched the creatures, he had not eaten them, but already he had done something more. He had taken the power of fear and bent it into something strange, something none of them could name. The lesson was no longer in the hands of the teacher, the lesson belonged now to the human, and all who sat there knew it. The human sat steady while the insects crawled across the glass, their glowing veins like rivers of fire pulsing in the dim chamber, their stingers dripping drops of venom that hissed faintly on the surface. The alien students leaned back in fear, but their eyes never left the strange human who had spoken with such calm. His words had unsettled the teacher, his question had stolen the power from the room, and now all waited to hear more. The silence stretched heavy as the teacher finally asked again if the human truly believed he could eat such creatures, if he truly believed venom could be nothing but another meal. The human's gaze did not waver, his hands rested against the edge of the table, and his eyes reflected the crawling swarm. He began to speak, and his voice was low yet carried across the chamber with the weight of a story that belonged to another world, a world the others could not imagine. He spoke of Earth, and he spoke not of peace, but of wild places where danger lived in every shadow. He told them of thick jungles filled with green walls of leaves and branches so dense that light could barely pass through, where snakes lay hidden, coiled above, ready to strike down with fangs of venom that killed in moments. And yet humans walked there, humans cut paths through the jungle, humans carried fire and stone and metal and made the wild their own. The students shivered, some pressing their limbs tighter against their bodies. The thought of such a place was nightmare enough. Yet the human's voice never shook. He told them of deserts wide and endless, where the sand burned beneath the sun, where scorpions crawled beneath stones, with tails curved like hooks, dripping with venom, waiting for prey to draw near. He told them how children of Earth learned to watch the ground, to read the shadows, to step with care, and how when hunger pressed too hard, even scorpions were caught, roasted over fire, eaten with care, and turned from threat into food. The alien teacher's claws tapped against the table, the sound sharp against the silence, his scaled face unreadable as he listened, his eyes narrowing as though weighing each word. But the human went on, and his words painted pictures that none in the chamber could look away from. He spoke of seas endless and dark, where creatures drifted with spines of poison hidden beneath fins, where a single cut could bring death. Yet humans sailed those seas, they fished, they hunted, they ate from the depths of danger, turning even the ocean into their table. The insects hissed, and scratched across the glass, their bodies restless, their venom glowing brighter, as if feeding on the tension of the room. The alien students shifted their eyes wide as the human leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried like thunder. He told them of a fish called the puffer that carried poison strong enough to kill in small amounts. Yet on Earth people learned to cut away the danger, to slice carefully, to prepare the flesh so it could be eaten safely, he said. That danger became a test of skill, and those who mastered it gained both pride and strength. A ripple moved through the alien students. Some gasped softly, others exchanged fearful glances, for what the human described was madness to them. Yet it was not madness to him. It was memory, it was truth, it was the way of his kind. The teacher finally spoke, his voice low, sharp, asking if the human meant to say that humans lived every day, surrounded by poison and death, asking if he expected them to believe that his world was a place where survival meant facing danger at every turn. The teacher's claws curled tight, as if gripping the weight of disbelief. Yet even as he spoke, his words lacked the cruel pride from before. The human lifted his hand slowly, hovering close to the glass, where the insects crawled their bodies, pausing as if sensing the warmth of his skin, but he did not touch. Instead, he spoke again, saying that humans were not born into safety. They were born into struggle. Every storm, every beast, every bite of food was once a danger, and that his ancestors learned to adapt or perish. He told them that humans ate what others would not. They fought what others would flee, and they endured what others called impossible. The alien students listened, their breaths shallow, their bodies trembling, but their eyes wide with fascination. Some had mocked humans before, calling them fragile, weak, unworthy of fear, but now they stared at one who spoke of venom as though it were bread and fire, as though it were comfort. The insects hissed again, their stingers clashing lightly against the glass, the sound sharp and deadly. Yet the human did not move back. His eyes stayed fixed, his voice steady, as he spoke of tribes that hunted spiders larger than a hand, roasting them over open flame, their legs cracking as the fire touched them, their poison neutralized by heat and turned into sustenance. He spoke of deserts where children learned to catch lizards quick and small, cooking them to survive. He spoke of forests where berries that killed were learned from trial and error, where knowledge was written not in books but in scars, and its survival passed down from one generation to the next. The teacher leaned closer, his scaled face tight with tension, his breath slow, as though weighing the truth of the words. He asked why humans would live in such a place, why their kind had not perished under the endless dangers of such a cursed world. The human answered with no hesitation, saying that it was because Earth itself was a trial, because Earth itself shaped those who walked upon it, and only those who could face danger could carry life forward. He said that his people were not special because they avoided death. They were special because they walked with it and did not bow to it. The words sank into the chamber heavy as stone. The alien students looked at him not with laughter, but with a strange mix of awe and dread. They saw that what they feared as certain death humans called only another challenge. The insects crawled higher. One of them pressed its spined body close to the glass before the human, the venom glowing like molten fire in its stinger. The alien students gasped, expecting him to pull away, but he leaned closer, his eyes unblinking, as though staring into the heart of danger itself, and he whispered again, almost too quiet for the others to hear, saying that on Earth this would not be a lesson of fear, it would only be another meal, waiting for flame. The silence that followed was heavy. No one dared to speak. The teacher's claws scraped against the table, his scaled face shifting between disbelief and something else, something darker, perhaps respect, perhaps unease, perhaps both. The lesson was no longer a display of fear. The lesson had become a mirror, showing that what one species called death another could call survival. The students realized it, the teacher felt it, and the human simply sat calm as the insects crawled. The question still hanging in the air, not forgotten, not answered, only waiting. Are they edible? The chamber was heavy with silence. The insects hissed and scratched their legs, clicking against the glass like knives against stone. The alien students sat frozen, their eyes locked on the human, who had turned fear into something else, their minds filled with confusion and dread, for nothing in their lives had prepared them for a creature that looked at venom and spoke of food. The teacher stood tall, his scales shifting with unease, his claws tapping the edge of the table, his power slipping like water through his hands. He had brought the swarm to control the class, to show them the meaning of danger, yet the human had taken the lesson and reshaped it into something strange, something unsettling. The teacher hissed slowly, his voice colder, Then before his scaled face twisted into a mask of anger, he declared that words meant nothing, and only action could prove the truth. He reached into the swarm, his clawed fingers fast and precise. He caught one of the insects in his grip. The creature thrashed violently, its stinger dripping venom, its mandibles snapping in fury. The teacher placed it inside a smaller glass container and locked it shut. He lifted the container high for all to see, his voice sharp as he declared that the human had spoken boldly. But now he must prove his words. He placed the container before the human, the insect within thrashing and striking against the glass, its venom glowing bright as fire. Gasps filled the chamber. The alien students leaned back even further. Some covered their faces with their limbs, unable to look. Some whispered that the human would die, that his madness had gone too far. Others watched with wide eyes, trembling in fear, yet unable to turn away, for what was about to happen was beyond any lesson they had ever imagined. The teacher's voice cut through the whisper, sharp and commanding. He ordered the human to open the container, to reach inside to show the class whether humans could truly eat danger, or if his words had been nothing but pride. The human sat still, his face calm, his eyes steady as they followed the movements of the insect. Inside the glass, the creature hissed, its glowing veins pulsing brighter, its stinger slamming again and again against the walls of its prison. Yet the human did not flinch. He leaned forward, resting his hands lightly against the table, his breath steady, his gaze unbroken. He studied the insect, the way its body moved, the way its legs scratched the rhythm of its strikes, and for a moment it looked as if he were not facing a deadly creature at all, but only a puzzle to be solved. The alien students whispered again, their voices trembling like wind through broken stone. They spoke of madness. They spoke of death. They spoke of humans as cursed beings touched by shadow, yet their eyes would not turn away. They watched as the human reached forward, his fingers brushing the surface of the container, his movements slow, deliberate, calm. The insect inside hissed louder, striking at the glass with renewed fury, yet the human did not pull away. His voice rose quietly, carrying across the hall as he spoke to the teacher and to the class, saying that on his world danger was not avoided, danger was studied, danger was understood, danger was faced until it became part of life. The teacher narrowed his eyes, his claws digging into the table, his scaled lips curling into a sneer. He demanded again, if the human truly meant to eat the creature, if he truly believed he could survive the venom. The human tilted his head, his lips carrying the faintest trace of a smile. He said that he could eat it, but not raw. He said that his people learned long ago that fire turned poison into food. He explained that what killed became strength once it was changed, once it was cooked and made safe. His words hung in the air, heavy and strange, leaving the other students trembling with unease. The teacher slammed his claw against the table, his voice rising in anger. He called the human a coward for refusing to act. He accused him of hiding behind stories and fire. The insect within the container thrashed harder, its venom dripping bright across the glass. The students gasped again, the sound filling the chamber like a storm. Yet the human only leaned closer, his breath fogging the container, his eyes watching the creature with calm intensity. And he spoke once more, saying that eating raw poison would prove nothing but foolishness. Survival was not about foolishness. Survival was about living long enough to learn. Survival was about shaping death into life. The insect struck against the glass again, its mandibles snapping with fury. The alien students shuddered at the sound. The teacher's claws curled tight, his scales trembling with anger. Yet he could not deny the strange weight of the human's words, for even as he mocked, even as he demanded proof, he saw no fear in the human's eyes, only calm, only certainty, only quiet strength. The human finally placed his hand on top of the container, his palm resting against the glass, his fingers steady. The insect hissed louder, striking again and again, but the human did not move back. His voice carried steady and quiet. He told the students that on Earth children were taught to respect danger, not to worship it, that they were taught to fight it, to tame it, to use it. He told them that what crawled before them was no different than the scorpions of deserts, no different than the snakes of jungles, no different than the fish of oceans. It was death, yes, but death could be turned into strength. The alien students whispered again, some trembling and all others shaking their heads in disbelief. But all were listening, all were caught in the grip of the human's voice. The teacher hissed louder, his anger mixing with unease, for he saw the shift in the eyes of his students. He saw the fear that had once belonged to him slipping away, drawn now to the calm of the human who had faced his test and turned it into something else. The human leaned back slowly, his hand leaving the container, his eyes still fixed on the insect, within, his voice dropping lower, but carrying with weight. He said that fear itself was a kind of venom, and that his people had learned to eat, even that his words sank into the silence heavy as stone, and none dared to speak. The insect thrashed the students, whispered the teacher, hissed, yet the human sat calm, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had changed. The test was not complete, the proof not given, but already the balance of the chamber was broken. Already the students looked at the human not with scorn, but with something they could not name, perhaps fear, perhaps respect, perhaps both. And in that moment the question that had begun the lesson still lingered, hanging heavy in the air: are they edible? The insect inside the glass container continued to thrash, its glowing veins pulsing with fire, like light under its black shell, its stinger dripping venom that sizzled when it struck the sides of its prison. The alien students leaned away, their eyes locked on the human, who sat calm, his hand resting near the glass, his gaze steady, as if the creature's fury meant nothing. The teacher stood tall, his scaled face twisted between anger and unease, his claws tapping hard against the table, his lesson of fear slipping further away with every word the human spoke and every breath he took. The human leaned closer, his voice quiet but carrying across the vast chamber. He said that his people had survived not because they avoided death, but because they faced it again and again until it lost its power. He told them that humans learned to fight storms with shelters built from stone, and what he told them, that they learned to hunt beasts larger than themselves, not with claws, not with fangs, but with tools made from bone and fire. He told them that what others called impossible, his kind had called survival. The alien students whispered, their voices low and trembling. Some said that the human was cursed, others said that he was lying, others still whispered that perhaps it was true, that perhaps the reason humans stood among them in this academy was because their world had shaped them into something strange, something dangerous. The teacher hissed, his scaled hands curling into fists, his voice rising sharp as a blade. He asked what pride the human found in such madness. What pride could exist in eating poison, in cooking death, in risking life? With every meal the human did not flinch, he did not break his calm. He lifted his eyes to the teacher, his lips forming a small quiet smile, and he said that pride was not the word survival, was the word life, was the word strength, was the word. And he told them that cooking was not weakness, cooking was the art of transforming danger into safety, cooking was the act of bending death until it served life. The insect hissed louder, its mandibles clashing against the glass, as though it sensed the human's words, as though it knew it was being judged as food. The human raised his hand slowly and touched the container lightly with his fingertips. The alien students gasped in horror, their voices rising in disbelief. Some shouted warnings, but the human ignored them, his eyes never leaving the insect, his hand steady, as he explained that on Earth fire was the great equalizer, that even venomous flesh could be turned harmless with the right flame. He spoke of tribes who roasted scorpions until their poison burned away. He spoke of seashells cooked over coals until toxins vanished. He spoke of plants once deadly made safe by boiling again and again until the poison washed away. The teacher growled, his voice sharp and mocking. He said that only fools would place death upon fire and call it a meal, but the human answered gently, saying that fools died and the wise lived, saying that those who learned to use fire walked forward, and those who did not were left behind. He explained that every human carried within them the history of struggle, that their blood remembered the long fight against danger, and that each time they turned poison into food, they proved again that they were meant to endure. The chamber grew quiet again, the alien students staring in silence, their strange eyes wide, their bodies trembling. Some pressed tighter against the walls, as though distance could protect them from the strange calm of the human, but others leaned forward, unable to look away, caught in the weight of his words, caught in the mystery of a kind that could laugh at venom. The insect struck again, its glowing stinger slamming against the glass, the sound sharp, like breaking bone. The human's lips curved faintly as though in memory, and he spoke again, this time telling them of a creature from the oceans of Earth, a fish called the puffer. One bite of its flesh filled with toxins strong enough to kill in heartbeats. Yet his people learned to cut it, to carve away what was deadly, leaving behind only the meat that could be eaten. He explained that to eat such a creature was a sign of skill and courage, that danger itself became a dish to be placed upon the table. The alien students gasped again, some shook their heads, others whispered of madness, yet none could hide the flicker of awe in their voices. The teacher's claws dug into the table, his scales shifting as though restless, his power fading as his lesson was turned against him. He wanted fear, but he found only confusion and something darker, respect. The human's eyes softened, but his voice sharpened as he said that survival was not only about strength of body, it was also about strength of mind. He told them that to face danger and see more than death was what made his people different. He told them that when others fled, humans learned to think. When others surrendered, humans learned to fight. When others died, humans learned to live again and again. The insect hissed louder, thrashing against the glass, its venom glowing bright. The human tapped the container lightly, his touch steady, his voice quiet yet sharp. He said that what crawled before them was not a god, not a curse, not an untouchable terror. It was only flesh and venom, and both could be changed, both could be beaten, both could be eaten. The alien students murmured, their fears shifting into something else. Their whispers carried words of disbelief, yes, but also words of wonder. They stared at the human as if he were not a student among them, but a reminder that his kind was carved from trials. They could not imagine. The teacher bared his sharp teeth, his voice rising once more, trying to break the spell. He shouted that the insects were sacred to his people, symbols of death and power. He demanded respect, he demanded fear, he demanded silence. The human turned his gaze upon him and spoke softly, but with a weight that crushed the chamber. He said that to his kind, sacred or not poison, or not danger, or not what mattered was survival, and survival meant seeing food. Where others saw death, survival meant seeing fire. Where others saw darkness, survival meant walking forward. When others stood frozen, he said that if the insects were sacred, then to humans, they were still only another meal, waiting for flame. The chamber was silent again, the teacher frozen, the students trembling, the insect hissing. Yet none of it mattered, for the human's words had carried through them all like fire, through dry grass, burning away certainty, leaving behind only questions, leaving behind only the weight of a truth they could not deny. The human leaned back slowly, his hands resting on the table, his eyes steady, his lips calm. He said nothing more, but his silence carried the same weight. As his words, the insect within the glass still struck again and again, but it no longer seemed terrifying. It seemed smaller, weaker against the calm of one who had claimed it as food. The students whispered again, their voices filled not with mockery, not with scorn, but with the faint stirrings of respect. The teacher's claws curled tight, his anger hot, his power shaken, his eyes fixed on the human who sat unbroken before him. And in that silence all knew that the lesson was no longer about venom, no longer about insects, no longer about fear. It was about humans, and the way they bent death into life. It was about humans, and the way they turned danger into strength. It was about humans, and the way they looked at poison and asked a question that no one else would ever dare: are they edible? The chamber was thick with silence. The venomous insect still thrashed inside its glass prison, its glowing veins pulsing brighter with every strike, its stinger dripping fire, like venom that hissed when it touched the sides. Yet the human did not flinch. His calm sat like stone, unbroken by the fury of the creature, unbroken by the words of the teacher, who stared at him with eyes full of anger and unease. The alien students watched with wide eyes, their bodies pressed against the walls, their breath shallow, their whispers hushed, as though afraid to disturb the balance that had shifted. The teacher had brought the insects to frighten, to remind his students of danger and of death, to make them tremble before his power. Yet the human had stolen the lesson with nothing but a question, and with every word, since he had made the swarm seem smaller, weaker, less than terror, and more like food. The teacher hissed, his scales shifting with agitation, his claws pressing deep lines into the surface of the table as he tried to regain control of the moment. He spoke, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence. He said that the insects were sacred, that they were symbols of death on his world, symbols of power that no one dared to challenge. He said that his people revered them as creatures of endless destruction, that no other species would dare to look at them and not tremble. He lifted his head high, his eyes burning, as he declared that fear was the lesson, and that any who defied fear would fall into ruin. But the human's face did not change. He tilted his head slightly, his lips forming the faintest smile, and his voice was calm when he answered. He said that sacred or not poison, or not his kind, had lived among creatures just as deadly, and worse. He said that his people did not bow to death. They endured it. He said that humans did not kneel before symbols. They survived them, and survival was the greatest power of all. The alien students whispered again, their voices low yet urgent. Some said that the human was a liar, others said that he was mad, but more than a few whispered, withal whispering, that perhaps it was true, perhaps this strange fragile being had grown upon a world where danger was common, where venom was food, where death was only another trial to overcome. The fear that had once filled their voices was shifting slowly into something else, something that the teacher could not control. Respect. The teacher's eyes narrowed, his anger burning brighter, but beneath it was something darker, something that he himself did not wish to admit. He felt the edge of fear, not of the insects, but of the human who sat calmly before him, who had turned his lesson into a mirror and shown him something he could not deny. The teacher had ruled his class with fear, yet here was one who treated fear as nothing, who stripped it of power with simple words, with quiet calm. The insect within the container hissed louder, its stinger slamming again and again, its venom glowing like fire drops. Yet the human leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass, his eyes steady, his voice low but sharp. He said that power was not measured by venom, not measured by stingers or glowing veins. Power was measured by the will to survive and the will to endure. He said that if the insect killed one human, others would learn to cook it. If it killed 10 humans, others would learn to trap it. If it killed 100 humans, others would still come with fire until it was nothing but another meal. The students gasped again, their eyes wide, their bodies trembling, not with fear of the insect, but with awe of the human who dared to speak such words. The teacher hissed louder, his claws scraping against the table, his scales flaring with unease. Yet he could not silence the shifting tide in the room. He could see it in the eyes of his students. He could hear it in their whispers. The lesson was no longer his, it belonged to the human. The human spoke again, his tone quiet but heavy. He told them the humans did not see death as the end, they saw it as the start of learning, that every failure, every bite, every scar was knowledge passed down, that each danger faced became memory, each poison faced became wisdom, and that wisdom was the weapon stronger than any venom. He said that humans did not bow to fear, they carried it and used it until fear itself grew weak. The chamber grew colder as his words lingered. The alien students shivered, their eyes wide, some hiding their faces, others leaning forward desperate to catch every word. The teacher stared at him, his sharp teeth bared, yet his voice caught in his throat, for even he felt the weight of the humans. Calm, the insects hissed and clicked, their bodies glowing brighter as though sensing the tension. Yet no one looked at them anymore, all eyes were on the human. He leaned back slowly, his hands resting on the table, his gaze steady, his silence now heavier than the words before. The teacher finally spoke, his voice strained. He said that humans were arrogant, that their pride would kill them, that no species could live forever by mocking death. He said that one day venom would claim them all, one day fire would fail, one day survival would not be enough. His words hissed like poison, yet they did not strike as before, for the fear in them was too clear, the unease too heavy. The human lifted his eyes, his calm unbroken, and he answered softly, saying that perhaps death would claim them one day, but until that day humans would eat, they would fight, they would endure. He said that his kind did not seek forever, his kind sought tomorrow, and tomorrow after tomorrow, until no more came. He said that this was their power, that death itself could not take away the days already lived, nor the strength already carried. The students whispered again, their voices now filled with something new, no longer only fear, no longer only awe, but respect, deep and uncertain respect for the fragile creature who sat calm before venom, who spoke of survival as though it were victory, who turned fear into nothing more than another meal waiting for fire. The teacher's eyes narrowed, his body tense, his anger cold, yet behind his anger was silence, for he knew the truth of what he had seen. The insect struck once more against the glass, its stinger cracking against the wall, its venom glowing bright. Yet no one gasped, no one cried out. Their eyes did not follow the insect, their eyes followed the human, and in that moment the balance was clear. The symbol of fear had been broken, the lesson had turned against its master. The teacher no longer commanded the room, the human did. The silence stretched heavy, the teacher's claws trembled against the table, his scales shifting, his eyes dark with fury. Yet all he could see was the calm smile of the human, the faint curve of lips that had stripped his power away. The whispers of his students growing louder, not mocking, not trembling, but speaking the truth, that they had all seen, that humans were not weak, that humans were not prey, that humans were something else, something dangerous. And in that silence the human lowered his voice, once more repeating the words that had broken the chamber from the start, words that now carried weight greater than venom. He asked, "Are they edible?" and no one dared to laugh. No one dared to mock the words. Were no longer madness, they were power. The venomous insect slammed once more against the walls of its glass prison, its mandibles snapping, its glowing stinger dripping bright drops of poison. The sound echoed sharp in the chamber. Yet none of the alien students cried out this time. None trembled, as before, for their eyes were fixed on the human, who sat steady, his calm unbroken, his words hanging heavy in the air. The teacher stood rigid, his claws pressing grooves into the surface of the table, his scales shifting with unease, his eyes narrow, yet filled with something he tried to hide, something that was not anger, something closer to fear. The human leaned back slightly, his gaze steady, his lips calm, as if the fury of the insect meant nothing, as if the sharp whispers of poison carried no weight. He had not touched the creature, he had not eaten it, yet he had taken all power from it with nothing but words. The alien students whispered again, but their voices no longer carried only dread. Their whispers were filled with awe, respect, even a trace of wonder, for they had never seen such defiance. They had never seen a creature so fragile speak with such strength. The teacher hissed low, his pride wounded, his power broken. He snapped the lock of the container and slammed it shut, trapping the insect. Once more in silence, he pushed it back into the larger glass case. With the others, the swarm hissed and clicked, restless, their glowing bodies flashing like embers in the dark. But their terror had already been stolen. The room no longer trembled with fear of them. The room trembled with fear of the human. The teacher straightened his tall frame, his voice cold though weaker than before. He declared that the lesson was over, that the swarm had shown enough, that no more would be proven. Yet his words did not carry the same command. As before, they wavered, they cracked against the silence. The students looked at him, but their eyes drifted back to the human, their thoughts no longer tied to the insects, no longer tied to fear, but tied to the calm figure who had spoken of survival as though it were victory. The human said nothing at first, his silence heavier than venom, heavier than the insects themselves. He sat with his hands folded, his eyes steady, as though he had already won, as though there had been no contest. His calm was not arrogance, it was truth, a truth that the others could not deny, a truth that even the teacher could not strip away. The alien students leaned closer, now some still trembling, but no longer with terror. They leaned forward to see him, to hear him again, to understand how one so fragile could turn fear into nothing. The teacher snarled, his scaled lips curling, his pride burning. He spat words of mockery, calling the human reckless, calling him mad. He said that humans were cursed, that they were blind to danger, that one day their arrogance would be their end. Yet even as he hissed, the edges of his voice betrayed him, for his words did not strike deep. They rang hollow. The students heard it, they felt it, and they turned their eyes away from him. The human finally spoke, his voice low but clear, his words steady as stone. He said that fear was a chain, and his kind had broken it long ago. He said that survival was not arrogance, it was life itself. He said that his people walked through jungles filled with venom, through deserts crawling with stingers, through seas haunted by poison, and they did not break. They endured, they adapted, they ate danger, until danger became nothing more than another story told around the fire. The whispers grew louder among the alien students, their voices mixed with fear and awe. They spoke of humans, not as fragile, not as weak, but as something else, something dangerous. In a way they could not define. The teacher felt the shift. He felt the balance torn from him. His claws tapped furiously against the table, his scales rippling with rage. But even he could not hide the unease burning within, for what frightened him now was not the swarm, not the venom. It was the human who sat calm, as though death itself were no more than a passing shadow. The swarm hissed restless, their glowing bodies pressing against the glass, but the students no longer cared. Their eyes were locked on the human, who seemed more dangerous than the insects, who seemed more powerful than the poison. Their whispers grew into silence, heavy silence, as they waited for more, waited for the next word, the next breath. The teacher tried to speak again, tried to command them, tried to remind them of fear, but his voice was no longer the voice of power, it was the voice of desperation. The human leaned forward, his eyes shining calm and sharp. He said that fear could rule the weak, but fear could never rule the strong. He said the humans had faced death in every form and learned that to survive was to change death into life. He said that poison could become food, storms could become shelter, darkness could become fire, and every danger could become strength, if only one dared to face it. His words struck through the silence like fire spreading through dry leaves, burning away the last remains of the teacher's power. The The students sat still, some trembling, some wide-eyed, but all silent. The teacher hissed, his anger boiling. Yet he could not move against the human. He could not deny what he had seen. He had tried to bring terror, but terror had turned against him. He had tried to teach a lesson, but the lesson now belonged to the human, who had claimed the chamber with nothing but calm, with nothing but truth. The swarm hissed again, louder, their glowing veins flashing, but their fury no longer held weight, for the students no longer feared them. They feared the quiet smile of the human. They feared the calm voice that spoke of eating venom. They feared the strange strength that came not from claws or poison, but from survival itself. And in that silence all knew that something had changed. The human had not lifted a weapon. He had not struck a blow, yet he had won. The teacher lowered his gaze, his scaled lips pressed tight as claws, tapping once more against the table, but no sound, no words could change what had already happened. His lesson had turned, his power had broken. His students now looked not at him, but at the human, with respect, with awe, with something like dread. And he knew he could not take it back. He had shown them death, but the human had shown them life, and life was stronger. The human sat steady, his voice quiet, as he repeated the words that had begun, everything, words that now carried weight far greater than before. He asked, "Are they edible?" And in the silence that followed, not one dared to laugh, not one dared to mock, not even the teacher, for all of them knew that the question was no longer madness. The question was truth. And the truth was this, that fear had been defeated, not by claws, not by venom, not by fire, but by a human who looked at death and smiled, who spoke of eating danger as if it were nothing, who turned terror into food and silence into respect. And in that moment the lesson was clear to all, that humans were not weak humans, were not prey humans, were something else, something that even the swarm could not match.